Pax vobiscum. I just got done working out in my garage, and I actually chose not to work out with my fan on because I wanted to basically create an experience for myself of physical discomfort, and I'm absolutely sweaty. And on my to-do list was to actually make a video about Liberty Jail and what other site? The visitor center I went to in Missouri. So I was like, what a perfect timing to do this. So I'm deciding to do it here. Um, I'm like literally sitting in a pile of sweat right now on the ground, and my shirt is absolutely drenched. I should probably like wring it out. Yeah, that's all sweat. I don't know if you could see that, but it's hot. In other words, it's hot. And it reminded me actually about the conditions that would have potentially occurred in the summertime in Liberty Jail. And right, it's in not Louisiana, it's in Missouri, it's hot. There's no good ventilation there. And so it's really easy for the mind to conceive and imagine, if you've ever been in sort of like a muggy, stagnant air type environment that's enclosed, how miserable that could be. And not only that, but in the wintertime, you're basically exposed to the elements without real shelter or warmth or source of comfort in that environment. And so before I get into that, though, I want to talk about just leading up to Liberty Jail. On the outside, again, these places, if they're considered significant or historically relevant, which Liberty Jail is incredibly relevant to the Latter-day Saint faith, and multiple very pertinent revelations have come out of there, or they're published in the Doctrine and Covenants in their book. And part of the reason those revelations are so profound, those words are so profound, is because they're relatable in so many different ways and perspectives to everyday life. Everyone, hands down, has experienced some capacity of discomfort, of feeling isolated, feeling hopeless, feeling helpless to certain degrees, variations, and situations and circumstances. And visiting that place and physically seeing and feeling the history that occurred there and what those 6 men endured, it deepens again that reverence and meaning behind those words of what it took to create the words that we all utilize today, or that the saints utilize today. So with that, obviously the landscaping was impeccable as usual. And going into it, I got there right around opening, actually. And so before the missionaries were giving the tour, I had a chance to read all the signs in the like waiting area. And I wanted to draw attention to a couple things, because again, these signs, the words, the choice of meaning that is conveyed by the interpretations, they orient a visitor to what is relevant. Hey, this is what we want you guys to remember and take away from this place. This is what was critically important to the history of how events occurred here. And just for familiarity, at that time period, the Latter-day Saints, they were basically, tensions were rather high. Things had gotten very tense, and tense not in a good way. Tense as in something violent or some sort of catastrophic thing is going to occur here because of how much pressure had built up between the locals and the incoming Latter-day Saints. Because again, a huge fluctuation of them just flooded into independence. And if you look at the plans of how the city was laid out, it overlapped with the pre-existing inhabitants there. And from the inhabitants that were originally there before the Latter-day Saints came down, they were scared. It was a very young time, relatively speaking, from the birth of the United States. Memory is still fresh of that type of rebellious nature, the insurrection, the autonomy, the agency that the United States innately utilized to break away from Great Britain. that type of culture, that type of feeling and belief is still relatively embraced throughout the United States. And so you can easily conceive that there is a fear potentially that different types of groups are going to try to create their own nations, their own countries out of the land that has been claimed or deemed as the United States of America. And so inevitably, right, some sort of tension is going to occur. There was a rather aggressive acts of physical violence and the expulsion of different people and displacement of property that was legally bought and things like that. But people need to understand that was a culmination of fear just piling and stacking until it became unable to be constrained to just talking in words. And with that, along came the arrest of the 6 Latter-day Saint leadership. And oftentimes this was coincided with when they were expelled too. So this is very typical human behavior. How do you cause the masses to be persuaded to abandon or change course? You take away their leadership. You cut off the head of the snake, symbolically speaking. I believe some of the 13 colonies, or I forget whose flag it was, but it shows a snake and it shows it cut into different sections. And that, again, originates from that type of symbology. Same thing that happened in Babylon, too, when they invaded and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. The Babylonians were aware if you cut off the people from their leadership, the people who create the organization, the authority, the leadership, the sense of identity, then it usually causes the rest of the people, the masses, to fall in line because they kind of are left without guidance or direction. And so it makes it a lot easier to squelch or prevent violence from occurring or rebellion, things like that. And so the Missouri government or the people in place at the time, they were aware of that and they utilized the same type of rhetoric, the same type of tactic to try to expel this large capacity, this large population of saints that had come into Missouri to settle in what was declared as Zion. And so in the process of that, these 6 men were arrested. And we're going to go into some coincidences or some ways that things I noticed and perceived when I was at the site that can easily be stacked and create meaning, but recognize that those things are all independent events, but you can easily contrive meaning to independent events to make a coherent narrative. But before I get into that, I wanted to highlight a couple of things from the signs. Because again, the signs at the beginning in the observatory, those placards indicate what is significant history. And this is one of the places where you see a very consistent underlying theme. And in one of the things, for instance, there's a sign saying letter from Mary Smith to Hiram Smith. So a letter from a woman to a man, basically. And what was so novel about the letter actually is that it maximized the efficiency of paper utilization. And I did that by writing both horizontally and vertically. And that is absolutely brilliant because not only do you turn one page into potentially front and back, now you turn it into direction and orientation, and you have 4 pages out of technically 1 sheet of paper. And so I thought that was brilliant, and I was giggling to myself because I said, of course, it would be a woman's letter and not the man's letter there, right? Because I'm sure the men did that same practice as well, but the church decided to showcase a woman's letter. We're going to see an underlying theme here, okay? Then next, we have another sign that said, letter from Emma Smith to Joseph Smith Jr., March 7th, 1839. Emma's letter to her husband Joseph prompted the prophet to call upon God for direction. Where else have we seen Emma provide some sort of prompting to Joseph in order to have an outcome of a revelation, if not the word of wisdom, which is, again, one of the most critical and pivotal texts within the Doctrine and Covenants. And so, again, we see a theme of the the revelation, the outcome didn't exist unless the original recognition or bringing to awareness occurred, which came from a female again. And then we go on, there's the third thing, right? Things like to come in threes, and we're going to see that later on. The third thing on the sign is, when possible, friends and family travel to Liberty to visit those in jail. I found out later that around 70 or so, according to the missionaries, the briefing they gave, around 70 or so saints had come and visited the jail. However, the church chose to decide to highlight very specific people that came to visit, and that included, again, women. And so with that, the sign says, on February 1839, Sisters Mary Fielding Smith, wife of Hiram Smith, and Mercy Fielding Thompson, along with 2 infant children, visited the prisoners and stayed overnight. Okay, with that, how many people would volunteer to go bring their newborn children and stay in those conditions voluntarily? It didn't highlight any men, it didn't highlight any loyalty or members doing that. It highlighted the women and the wives, right? So again, at the actual exhibit, you see example after example after example highlighting the efforts of women that often go unacknowledged. And I would argue that's evidence of Heavenly Mother, yet Heavenly Mother isn't mentioned anywhere or acknowledged whatsoever. And the same thing happened, actually, we'll get into it later. We're going to go into it now, actually. The Visitor Center. At the Visitor Center, there's a story when the printing press was destroyed. 2 sisters, very young, they're like, one was 8 or 14, 15, something like that, very young, children by all means. They are the ones that recognized that while all this chaos is going on, they're destroying the papers. They grab a handful of those papers and run off and hide with them. And men even chase them to try to find them. Again, an example of Heavenly Mother's contribution to the existence and survival of the Latter-day Saint movement and faith, yet no acknowledgement. And, you know, if Heavenly Father was supposed to get credit for that, it would have been brothers that did the papers, but it was sisters. And these sites highlight the feminine presence, Heavenly Mother's presence within those historical contexts, yet she's not acknowledged whatsoever publicly. And so it just becomes that's a beautiful tension there, where as in that could be expanded upon and openly acknowledged to receive credit where credit is due. And I'm aware a couple people previously have told me, well, as a mother, I don't need credit for those things. As women, we don't need credit. We don't need center stage. I get that. I'm not saying you got to be the one to stand up to receive the reward or whatnot, but I'm just saying, how would you feel if you cooked dinner, you washed the clothes, you did all these things around the house, and your kids repetitively over and over every single day said, "Thanks, Dad, for folding the laundry. Thanks, Dad, for making dinner." How would you, as the wife, as the female that did those actions, feel with that level of acknowledgement? And that is the same type of rhetoric and logic that is being applied to Heavenly Mother. People keep saying Heavenly Father's getting all the credit, Heavenly Father, but clearly some of these actions are correlated to Heavenly Mother, yet no one wants to say it out loud. So I don't know what's going on there. Anywho, going into the exhibit though, 2 wonderful missionaries. I ended up staying longer and talking with them after because, again, the thing that makes these places so significant and so meaningful is the continuous effort of the volunteers, of the people that bring the meaning to those places in the first place. And those missionaries, those 2 female missionaries, did a beautiful job demonstrating and highlighting why they are even doing and putting forth effort to achieve or highlight something that they found relevant to their lives and to, again, a community that millions of people follow and believe in. But going into the jail, they did an excellent job going through the tour, but going into the jail, some of the subtleties you notice, obviously, when you first walk in, the building itself gives you that innate sense of awe and reverence when you're like as if you're walking on hallowed ground, because the architecture is very reminiscent of things that you perceive or see inside temples. And when I first walked into the room, because if you've never been there, the jail, the original flooring and foundation is there still. The floor that Joseph Smith and those 5 other men slept on is there. Then everything else, I believe, is a reconstruction of exactly how it was. And with that, the surrounding enclosure is almost like an atrium, like a mausoleum. It reminded me of the baptismal font I saw in the San Diego temple, where you walk in and see almost like this portal, because in the middle of like this spoke wheel design on the ceiling was a circle right over the center of where the jail is. And again, you can correlate meaning and assumption to that. You can say it's like a direct transcendent state that could be invoked, connecting you to the celestial realms, things like that. Again, these observations create more depth of meaning the more you notice. And with that, coincidentally speaking, the staircase leading up to the jail, there's 6 steps on each side. And again, there was 6 men that went in there. 6 steps on each side promotes symmetry. You get the total of 12. 12 is, again, a very pivotal number and meaningful in religious contexts. And then also on the door had 6 bolts going across and 12 bolts going up. Again, you can correlate those types of things to different meaning and symbolism. Not saying that that's necessarily correlated, but you can easily contrive meaning and see how that creates a coherent narrative, and then you can utilize it to further validate assumptions that are already in place or embraced. Also, again, with the ceiling design, I believe there was 9 spokes on the wheel. 9 oftentimes represents various meanings of symbology and reverence and things like that. And you can correlate all those things, that they're all derived off of multiples or some sort of mathematical recursion based on 3. 3, again, is important for the Trinity, things like that. So you can see how this layered symbology can build very easily. You can correlate it to different things. Not saying that that's what's occurring there, but you can see how assumption starts to build and create a depth of meaning that perhaps was hidden in plain sight type deal. The human mind, again, is prone for capturing patterns and recognizing these things and creating meaning and correlation from seemingly disconnected pieces. And hopefully everyone can easily perceive and understand how that can symbolically play into the storyline of saying that this was obviously divinely guided, this was that, things like that, right? Doesn't mean that necessarily. It's just pointing out all these subtleties that you can contrive meaning to if you desire to utilize that in your experiences in life. So going on with that, hearing the things that occurred there, everyone's already familiar with the story that happened there, and I won't go into detail of that, but just highlighting again, I think the reason why that passage and that revelation came about is because everyone has been in that type of situation before. And being aware about how large the movement was at that time, it was obvious that the Latter-day Saint faith was going to necessarily spread globally because of the momentum it innately carried and the effort behind it. Oh, sorry, thirsty. So with that, it became important to document these things. Beyond the spiritual and religious aspect, people need to recognize these 6 men stayed in an isolated area that were basically imprisoned, that arguably in this day and age would be deemed unconstitutional. But again, things were different back then. And so surviving those situations, being in a place where they don't necessarily understand what they did wrong, because from their mind and from our modern day lens, arguably no laws were actually broken as far as constitutional rights go. For the era at the time, the local government perceived it as a threat. And it's easily understandable how they perceived it as a threat, because at the visitor center, actually, they had copies of the printing press, the book that they had printed, the Book of Commandments. And they originally handed out copies of the Book of Commandments, like a literal little book that they had. And on the cover, they titled it Book of Commandments. That's all that's written there. But then when they were going about talking about the portion where the printing press was destroyed and those two sisters grabbed a couple of the copies and saved them, preserved them, those papers that came handed out, they actually reveal the full title of what the printing was actually saying. And let's step into someone that is not of the faith and of that time period in the 1800s again. Look at what they would have perceived of this. The actual book that was published said, a book of commandments for the government, keyword is government, of the Church of Christ, organized according to law. Again, the word law is critical, and then it gives the date. Do we understand now how a local government at the time of elected officials, a society that's already functioning, would have serious concerns about thousands of people that abruptly arrive, and all of a sudden the first thing they want to publish includes a book that says government and law on it? Do we see how that can cause conflict and innate fear? It would be equivalent now to someone publishing something like that. People would innately question, what government are you talking about? Are you trying to commit treason against the United States government? What kind of laws are you talking about? Is this written in the Supreme Court law or the Constitution? What are we correlating this to? And you can easily perceive how that type of pamphlet would easily be contrived to the meaning of treason and something that is originating from anarchy and that type of assumption of meaning and correlation. They didn't care about whether people were following God or whatnot. All they potentially saw was government and law. And they thought, okay, they actually have enough people here to make this become a threat to the actual local governance and laws that are set up in this state. What are we going to do about it? And so you can see how that became easily a threat. And fortunately, later on, the church changes it to like Doctrine and Covenants, because they recognize, again, words carry heavy assumption and a meaning, depending on what words you utilize and in which context, and your capacity to explain the meaning behind the words you choose to articulate yourself. That carries a lot of assumption, and that leads to greater depth of understanding, or it potentially introduces misunderstanding without anyone becoming aware of why it even occurred. And with that, coincidentally, you see that the prisoners, they end up having basically an empathetic escape type deal. And from the guards basically let them go free, and then they have to trek their way all the way up to join the Saints in Illinois, I believe. But with that change of heart from those prisoners, and that things occurred because the local governance, the town and everyone recognized, hey, the threat has been expelled. They've settled elsewhere. There's no real threat of them coming back. Are we going to actually do something with these people? Because now they've moved elsewhere. They're no longer an issue. Let's just kind of, what are we keeping them for? There's no reason to keep them type deal. But then the government most likely didn't want to look stupid or ridiculous, being like, we imprisoned you guys basically for no reason because we were scared. that doesn't look good on anyone's, outlook. And so it's understandable that the escape or the release occurred when it did. It doesn't discount the hardship that was endured and the beautiful outcomes that arose because of it, but it does make coherent sense about why the timing happened the way it did. And again, you can contrive that to different meaning and interpretation. You can utilize different words to explain the same outcome and event, and it will carry different weight. For instance, from a Latter-day Saint perspective, you can easily say that is evidence of heavenly parents protecting the saints and revealing that the revelation and the doctrine are true. But it also reveals, hey, objectively speaking, the threat was removed from Missouri and it coincidentally aligned with the release kind of thing, right? You can say all sorts of origins of where the ideology of why that occurred, and it doesn't matter how you explain it. The fundamental principle is that the outcomes demonstrate the meaning behind the event occurring. So with that, actually, with the missionaries, I wanted to highlight them because I love talking to them. And I noticed actually, it's kind of like the saints or the different historical sites. It operates a little bit how Chick-fil-A used to operate, which is, how you usually have the women in the front and the men in the back cooking. Everywhere you go, you always see female missionaries, unless it's a senior missionary couple working there together. It's always female missionaries giving these tours and never the male missionaries. So I found that kind of ironic and playful because, again, it's playing on different stereotypes and different types of perceptions, which is clever, but also recognize that you could easily say that, Heavenly Father's missing from this picture, or are these sites correlated more so to Heavenly Mother's perspective? What's the purpose behind that? One thing I forgot to mention, one thing I did want to say is the language that the missionaries used to tell these stories. 100%, no one can argue those were traumatic events. Those were physically hard events where property was lost, money was lost, lives were lost, effort, time. So many tragic things easily occurred there. But with that, the tours, they never focus on that negative language. They rarely use the word expulsed, forced out, threatened, those harsh, violent terms that you correlate to tragedy and violence and a sense of wanting justice. They don't utilize those terms necessarily to talk and share these stories, but they still convey the huge depth of reverence and meaning and significance behind what occurred there. They use terms like moved out of Missouri. They were potentially used the word forced, but oftentimes they would say like displaced. They don't use aggressive words. They try to utilize neutral words to describe a traumatic event. And I find that a very huge level of maturity and stewardship over storytelling and historical accuracy, because it removes this biased perspective of storytelling. Because oftentimes when people have gone through some sort of hardship, they tell the story from a victim mentality. They tell the story from a state of seeking justice and revenge and making sure to highlight the awareness of what occurred to them. And oftentimes for people, those words provide validation for their experience, but it necessarily doesn't convey the importance and significance of what occurred. Because again, it plays on that emotional layer, and it plays on people relying on buying into that violent or that emotional resonant type structure. But I would argue the emotional resonance deepens and produces a greater state that could be easily defined as reverence and sanctity, maturity towards telling these stories, because the words that they present, the way they present these stories is presented from as an objective as possible lens, even though they were the ones that experienced a traumatic event. So I thought that was cool. And so talking to those missionaries, so I'm going to go on and talk about the missionaries now at the Liberty Jail, because I told them I was just passing through. They were unaware that I'm not a member. None of them actually were aware that I wasn't a member or not, whatnot, because I get a lot of assumptions. People think I'm a member, I'm what's it called, an investigator of the church, but all these sorts of different labels arise, and I just don't correct them. I just allow the assumption of meaning to play out, and I just continue on my way, because I'm, again, aware about the importance and the nuance of language and what it does in different environments. So I want to make sure that I'm respecting entering these worlds, these different perspectives, with full awareness and trying to meet people into language that is commonly understood, so it prevents misunderstanding from occurring. So when I talked to the missionaries, I highlighted their testimonies. Again, I said things like what they're doing now. Oftentimes people say that it's putting your life on hold. Why would you ever want to put your life on hold for a couple years? Or you're serving this mission towards like God and Jesus and things like that. But also practically what it's doing is it's developing a huge capacity to navigate life's challenges with more confidence and assurance in one's ability to even navigate them in the first place. Those young ladies are building, and the young men that I ran into, they're all building a great capacity to experience the complexities and diversity that humanity brings to the table, and they're able to do it with more assurance and more confidence in themselves because of the experiences and the effort they're doing now. And both of them, they're actually going off to Nashville next, I believe, to serve the rest of their mission, because the parts where they serve as tour guides for visitors, that's like a temporary, like 4-month or 5-month assignment, and then they do their other assignment or mission calling as part of that experience. Again, very beautiful demonstration of the same principle is utilized in the military, where you move people around to different bases, or like a promotion of responsibility. Same type of layering of introducing more opportunity and more chance to show and demonstrate responsibility in a gradient manner to prevent it from feeling like someone's drowning. That approach works very beautifully for a lot of people, but again, it's not wrong or should be embarrassing or discouraging if someone doesn't necessarily learn through that modality. And that comment's in reference to, because I'm aware of a statistic that I recently saw where 1 in 3 female missionaries go home, and 1 in 5 male missionaries end up like leaving their missions early for a majority and plethora of reasons. That type of behavior in itself demonstrates a huge level of courage and bravery, because those kids are well aware about what their actions are going to be perceived as. People will easily potentially label them as a failure, be embarrassed about it, feel like they disappointed others, and it's none of those things, because it takes the same capacity of courage and bravery to outright say those things, saying, hey, I am choosing to go home early because this is something that is not my calling. And listening to that internal guidance, listening what you guys call the Holy Spirit, having that revelation, that intimate relationship with oneself along with the divine, allows for that trajectory to unfold with the same level of courage and bravery it takes to even complete a mission. So same outcomes, different paths is what I'm saying. And so they should both be honored and acknowledged with equal reverence and respect. Anywho, what else did I do? I'm looking at photos here. Oh, one thing I wanted to highlight from the Visitors Center was that there was a beautiful table of all the different books of Mormon and all the different translations while we're waiting to go through the rest of the exhibit. And I love that. It was beautiful. And the symbolic layering and even the pretty layers. I think there was actually three rows, 3 levels of books. And then you have the globe and the planet Earth there. Again, you can layer on that symbolism, the 3 tiers of the afterlife kingdoms, the Trinity, right? Humanity loves threesomes. It's the most stable shape. I digress. But one thing I noticed, and I asked Hiller about that because we went to the visitor center after Pioneer Day, which I'm going to make a whole other video about Pioneer Day and then going to the different sacrament meetings that I went to, because that's just a whole nother whimsy in itself. But what I noticed was there was no Hebrew translation, and I asked about it. And they said, oh, there's some sort of agreement with Israel or whatnot in regard to not proselytizing or establishing things, and that included not having a book translated into Hebrew. Not saying that there's copies of in Hebrew of the Book of Mormon that don't exist because independent people did it, but officially from the church, that was an agreement to not translate the book into Hebrew. And I wanted to highlight something because that shows a huge level of respect for Judaism and a different belief system. And the fact that that sort of agreement can even occur shows a absolute profound level of camaraderie and unity that is unacknowledged in public because the actions don't innately demonstrate that that's possible. But then here we are with evidence showing that 2 faiths that can arguably be seen as competing with one another and show a different perspective of the same core monotheistic origin, showing that level of respect, being like, hey, let's agree on this and let's coexist with one another. And that's a beautiful demonstration of it. But also it subtly highlights a underlying fear that is has become embodied within humanity as a whole, because from a Jewish perspective, they fear proselytizing or they fear conversion from their identity, and they don't want that. And so the way they try to minimize that is they prevent any other material from being published in their language. That demonstrates a sense of fear or anxiety that doesn't necessarily need to exist, but the action and behavior is being interpreted that way. And luckily, the Latter-day Saints respect that interpretation, that boundary, and they willingly choose to not cross it, just out of respect, again, for the foundation of Judaism and that aspect of monotheism. I'm unsure if that would actually occur if other religions tried to do that, like if Islam tried to do that. Unsure what would happen, right? Would the church say, no, like, you guys can go kick rocks, we're going to do this? But with Judaism, for some reason, they demonstrated that very existential capacity to coexist with one another. What else did I notice? I think I will leave that all for now because I did do some other stuff. Well, I'll just highlight it real quick because Temple Lot, y'all, it's ironic because the Latter-day Saints actually weren't ever able to build a temple there, but other churches that split off during the Restoration movement were able to build churches there. And so I obviously wanted to honor and acknowledge them because they are fundamentally acting as like the children of the origin of Joseph Smith, like the offspring of his efforts. And that deserves acknowledgement. Whether you agree with it or not, doesn't matter. You can acknowledge the effort and what their presence there, because again, they provide a greater depth of meaning and reverence for that space. So I had fun actually going around the Community of Christ temple there. And they had like one of my favorite Bible verses actually they had a plaque there, and they had a little statue with a man, like an iron statue, demonstrating the verse that was mentioned on the little placard. And that verse says, this is my favorite line, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And that is just so beautiful. That is basically saying that humanity as a whole is going to reach such a profound level